Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton, he's spoken out today regarding the High Court decision. We've spoken about that decision, the decision that came down on Tuesday, that people born overseas but who identify as Aboriginal cannot be deported from Australia. He's saying he's open to introducing legislation to rectify the issue. Sky News Across Australia host Peter Gleeson is in Brisbane, and Nine Radio's political reporter Michael Packy, he's a new one for me on the show. Great to have you on the show, Packy, joins me from Canberra. Great to have you both, gentlemen. I'll start with you if I can. Gleeson, all of these restaurant shenanigans and carry on about coal inside Labor, it certainly has been a tough fortnight for the coalition, but this would have put a bit of a spring in their step as they left Canberra today.
Oh, absolutely. And the reality is, Peter, that Anthony Albanese cannot win the next election unless he fixes this problem with coal, because we know that the good folk of Capricornia, Flynn, Dawson and Herbert won't vote for him unless he actually goes pro-coal. We saw that at the last election. We got the Deputy Premier in Queensland running around before May 18 saying that all miners need to re-skill. The left faction of the Labor Party have a problem with coal. They're in bed with the Greens on these, climate change zealotry positions that they take. And I don't know how Albanese is going to negotiate this very troubled path going forward, because Fitzgibbon and the Otis group, what a lovely name for a sort of a right-wing pro-coal group, they will be, up his ribs heading into the next election saying, you need to ensure that we have mining jobs in the Hunter and in central Queensland, because if you don't, and we saw what happened with Michelle Landry, she polled 85% in the booth of Clermont, which is, in the Galilee Basin. That is normally 85% to Labor, because they were very scared that, the Labor Party was going to cost them their job.
Look, absolutely, and Packy, I know what Anthony Albanese is trying to do is downplaying this meeting, and if it was just this meeting alone, even a couple of dinners, you could probably look the other way. But we know the CFMEU in Victoria has put forward a parliamentary submission to an inquiry under the Andrews government, and they want to see high-efficiency, low-emission coal-fired power stations built. They also want to have a debate about nuclear power for Australia. Now, that's a very powerful union, and it's a very influential and financially influential union inside Labor. So this is real.
Oh, absolutely, Peter. This is definitely real, and there's no doubt that Anthony Albanese was always going to downplay it today. But when you think of even the size of the group, it's about 20 Labor MPs that are believed to be involved in this Otis group faction that are trying to promote coal projects. It's definitely real, and it's definitely an issue that Anthony Albanese has to deal with. And I suppose the other difficulty with Anthony Albanese is that of late he does seem to have had a bit of a confused position on this issue of coal. In December, he was up in Queensland and he was meant to be visiting some of those regional seats which have coal mines and coal miners, but he didn't seem to go near them. He just went up to a certain extent and then didn't go much further to see these mine workers. Then he seems to be trying to play down the significance of coal, especially over the past week or so, where he said that as far as he's concerned, Labor is not interested in building any new coal mines, full stop. He was that definitive on radio. And now he's having to deal with this group this Otis group, which is saying that coal needs to be considered to be in the mix, and that mining workers can't be alienated. So it is a difficult one for Albanese to navigate, but this is definitely a real threat for him, despite what he's saying.
Yeah, and I'll just stay with you, Packy, because I was watching Question Time today, and I'm assuming you're in your usual spot watching from below onto the chamber. And Melissa Price got to the dispatch box. People will remember she was once the Environment Minister. She was in a witness protection program in the election campaign, but she's now in the Outer Ministry. She got demoted. She's in charge of defence procurement, and of course the submarine would be the biggest program on her desk. It's $200 billion now, the build and the sustainment part of it. There's been reports saying Australia should seriously consider walking away from this contract, tearing it up. It's got to be, they say, an open conversation inside the government. There's also issues that only 50% of the expenditure now will hit Australian companies. A whole reason Christopher Pyne got it built in Adelaide was for jobs and benefit for the state of South Australia. You know, I am concerned, Michael Packy, this is such a complex issue, but it's a critical issue for Australia's future, and I don't think we're having a serious enough debate about it in the country.
Well, it wouldn't appear so, given the billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars that are involved here. And you're right, towards the end of question time, it was very interesting that Richard Marles, the Deputy Labor leader, did start putting some of the heat on Melissa Price. She is the minister responsible for this build. And what's interesting about this is that last year, or towards the end of last year, the Labor Party really was going Melissa Price when she was the Environment Minister, and she wasn't performing too well at the dispatch box. And so I think that Labor feels that this is an area where they can really hammer Melissa Price on this issue on the build of the submarines. And as you mentioned, there are these reports that have been out in the Australian newspaper over the last day or so, suggesting that the French aren't too interested in giving some of the work to local contractors. Now, what Melissa Price had to say in question time today is that there's about 130 subcontractors that have gotten some work, but she couldn't guarantee that that work would be binding in the future. So that does raise some serious questions that local businesses and local jobs may not benefit out of this contract. And then you were talking about earlier about this issue of nuclear and whether or not that we should consider nuclear submarines. And of course, we don't really have a nuclear industry as such in Australia. And I know this is an argument that Greg Sheridan was making in his editorial today. But I was thinking, though, you've got people like Keith Pitt, who's a Queenslander who's been a proponent of nuclear in the past. You wonder whether or not someone like Keith Pitt, even though he's in cabinet, whether he will still try and agitate for some sort of a nuclear industry or some sort of low-level nuclear industry.
But the difficulty is he's not in the National Security Committee by virtue of his portfolio, and I think that the way in which the promises that were made under Turnbull and under Christopher Pyne have not been then repeated or entrenched in the contracts, and Price is now trying to retrofit what I consider poor contracts and a poor design. Like, we will spend billions taking a good nuclear sub and making it a pretty ordinary conventional sub. But I could talk about subs all night. I want to move on to Jackie Trad, because there's a lot of word out on the street. She's a Deputy Premier, Gleeson, and she's also the Treasurer, not a great Treasurer at that. Pressure on her to resign. People are worried that she'll take a real shine off the Palaszczuk government and cost them power in the October state election. How true is all this?
Yeah, very true. I mean, they've got internal polling suggesting that her brand is so toxic that it's actually worse than Clive Palmer in the regions. I mean, as I said earlier, she's the one who said before May 18 that the good miners in central Queensland should re-skill, that coal mining was to be phased out, despite the fact that they get about $5.5 billion a year in royalties from the Galilee Basin. But look, Trad has gone from the rooster to the feather duster in Queensland politics in 9 months. She was embroiled, of course, in the integrity scandal. We now know that had she have done that in the future, she would have been jailed for what she did. The CCC came down and said, this is not on. We can't do it now under the current protocols, but if you do it again, or if anyone else does this again, you will go to jail. And of course, then we saw the way in which she has handled the budget here in Queensland. She's put so many public servants on. Our debt has ballooned, and of course, we now have probably the worst economy in the country. And the problem for Anastasia Palaszczuk, the Premier in Queensland, is that it's affecting her own personal brand. Her figures in the recent Courier Mail poll were worse than Campbell Newman before he was beaten in 2015. It's a terrible, parlous state of affairs for the Labor Party in Queensland. The only way in which she will survive is with the support of the United Voice Union, the boss Gary Bullock, who she's known for many years. But of course, Bullock doesn't want to get rid of her because she keeps putting on these public servants, and they derive all their membership from the public service here in Queensland.
Well, there you go. Left hand feeding the right hand. Got to leave it there. Michael Packy, Peter Gleeson, thanks very much for your time tonight.